Well, friends, I'm pleased to have with me on this episode of Liberty Dispatch Interviews, friend of the show, friend of mine, co-belligerent in several initiatives, one Dr. David Haskell. He's a professor and social scientist at Wilfrid Laurier University and has been for nearly 2 decades. He has researched, taught, and published on the connection between Christian conservatism and positive societal outcomes and the tensions between Christian conservatives and the country's cultural elites, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about together today. Outside of academia, Dr. Haskell uses his skills as a researcher and speaker to debunk false claims made by progressives related to Christians, DEI instruction, critical race theory, and radical gender ideology. He's a member of several advocacy organizations fighting for freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. And he fairly recently has become a rather young, good-looking grandpa. You certainly don't play the part of grandpa. So, David, thanks so much for joining me on Liberty Dispatch Interviews. Great to have you.
It's a real pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to hang out. In
Yeah.
person's better, but digital will take that. So I reached out to. I wanted to have you on the show. There were a few things I wanted to talk about, and they have everything to do with the situation, right? The current state of conservatism in Canada and how we're supposed to understand and approach it from a Christian perspective. There's been quite a few things that have happened just in the last several months. We have the tariffs, they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. We've had an election in Ontario. We've had, so as of time of recording, we are before the new Liberal leader will be announced. And who knows, by the time we air this, it might be a snap election called. Who knows? So lots happening in the country. And so I want to talk about some of that. But to set that up, I want to talk about the article you wrote for the American Conservative, and the article has to do with, and there was a whole slew of articles. I know Pastor Tim Stevens wrote an article. I know Jacob Rayom had talked about it as well. I'd written about it. It's what do we do with the soft threats or the we'll make it economically difficult to annex Canada, or if they, or we'll have them join us willingly. And is Trump serious? Is he not? What do we make of this? And so you wrote an article, and I wanted you to maybe give us the synopsis, give us kind of the high level perspective that you're bringing, and then let's flesh out some of the details for us to try to understand how do we respond to and approach all of this madness.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people, as you've noted, have been discussing this idea of Canada as the 51st state. And for anybody who's been sleeping under a rock, they might have missed that Trump was talking about it at the end of 2024. He introduced the idea when he was at a dinner with Prime Minister Trudeau at Mar-a-Lago at his place in Florida. And he was joking around at the time, it seemed. He said, what would happen if you didn't have the United States? I mean, I'm summarizing, of course. And Trudeau said, well, we'd cease to exist, is what Trudeau said. And Trump said, well, therefore, maybe you should be the 51st state. It was kind of a joke at the time, and people were thinking, it was never going to move beyond a little bit of good-natured ribbing. But then Trump kept introducing the idea, and it's like, is this guy serious? And then he's saying things like, you guys would pay 60% less tax if you joined. You'd have better military protection. So he keeps going on, and reporters begin to ask him, are you kidding? Are you not kidding? Well, then comes his inauguration speech in January, and he explicitly talks about expanding territory. And, he's setting the agenda for the next 4 years. And this is accompanied by him also saying that he wants Greenland. And he's really made some moves toward trying to acquire Greenland. In addition to that, he wants to acquire the Panama Canal. He wants to get it back. It was the Americans in the first place. He wants it back. So this idea that he might make Canada the 51st state is being seen as a potential threat by some Canadian politicians. Now, others have said, no, he's still joking. Well, what I did in the article in the American Conservative is I looked at a series of scenarios and just played with them a little bit. And so I looked at it in three ways. I said, okay, if it were the case that Trump wanted to have all of Canada as the 51st state, well, that's a terrible idea.
Yes.
It's a terrible idea for him, is what I mean.
Another California. That
Right,
would be
exactly.
If you got all, that's what
honestly,
you get if
it is
another California.
Yeah, and that would mean between 45 and 48 representatives in the lower house, and it would be 2 extra senators in the Senate for them. Now, it depends how you divide up Canada, but really, from a population standpoint, you could say all of Canada could become a state. But as you've already pointed out, it would be a democratic state for the most part. You've got this little aberrant rump in Alberta, maybe a little bit of Saskatchewan. So that'd be not a great idea if you are trying to solidify the MAGA movement in the US in perpetuity. So, to your point, not a great idea. Then I go to scenario 2, and I say, it seems that there's already an affinity between Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, and Trump. She visited him on her own. They seem to have a good relationship. So there's already something going on there. Now, Smith has unequivocally said, no, I'm not interested in any overtures. He hasn't made any overtures to me about becoming the 51st state. So as I introduce this, I'm playing pretensies, right? I'm just saying, well, what are the potential there? And I do note that among all the provinces, in recent polling from the beginning of this year, the people in Alberta had the highest level of support for becoming a 51st state. So that's one thing. Another thing on the side of the Americans, why they might be interested, this would really help them to become free of dependence on Saudi oil, because there's so much oil in Alberta. It's the third greatest, or second or third for reserves of oil. And that's a real benefit to the US to have them on board. Even from an ideological point of view, Alberta is the province that is most solidly conservative. In a lot of ways, they have a worldview similar to their neighbor below them. I guess it's Montana. They've got that ranching spirit, that independent spirit, very conservative, independent. So in that way, I was saying, well, it might be interesting for Alberta. And I again, I'm not saying this has to happen. I'm just saying, let's look at it. It would be a real benefit to Alberta, to be honest. They pay about $2 billion a year in transfer payments. It is unconscionable.
Well, they're
what is done to them.
Central Ontario. And this was the point in Tim Stevens' article, where he essentially, the case he made was Alberta needs to bring Canada and the United States to the table and say, whoever makes the better deal, that's the way we're going to go, because we need to do what's best for us as a province, because we subsidize central Canada, right? We're not the beneficiaries of any of these transfer payments. It's just central Canada. What happens in Ottawa and Quebec and Toronto determine the fate of our province. And because of interprovincial trade regulations and our federal government's insistence on not tapping into our natural reserves, we are putting a cap on what could be an even more profitable, even more beneficial, even more flourishing industry. And so Canada, make your pitch. US, make your pitch. And we're going to go whichever way we think is best for Albertans. That's kind of the argument he's making in the article.
And I don't think it's a fair fight. I mean, right. if you have the world superpower down on one knee with a ring, there's not much that Canada can do. And the other side of that is Canada has so sorely abused Alberta. I mean, for decades, Alberta has had to watch half of their profit from energy go to Quebec, who will not allow them to run pipelines. I mean, it's like being an abused spouse. And from my perspective, so let's go back and let's say, okay, well, what if they did say, show us your best offers, where they compared the US offer to the Canada's offer? I mean, there's a precedent for that. Look at all of the privileges beyond anyone else in the Confederation of Canada that Quebec has gained by doing just that.
They have an oversized influence, and decisions made to the benefit of Quebec do not match what it contributes to the country. It's kind of silly.
Now, from the point of view, and again, I want to be a neutral arbiter here. If I were a Quebecer, I'd think my politicians are geniuses. And that's very Machiavellian, but I'm saying, they were able to wrest from the government. They have their own. I want to make sure I'm right with this. Yeah, they do get to set their own immigration numbers in Quebec. Mm-hmm. Like they were able to wrest that. They for sure they get their own pension plan and they get to manage it the way they want. They have numerous other powers that have never been ceded to the other provinces, simply because they continue to threaten, we'll leave. If you don't give it to us, we'll leave. Alberta, to its credit, has never done that, but Alberta, to its detriment, has never done that.
Right. Yeah. And it's also a different time now.
Yeah. So that's scenario number 2. And I didn't go deep into that, but of course, then there is the issue. Let's say that Alberta did finally say to Trump, okay, your offer sounds good. What are they going to do with all the other Canadians who want to flood into Alberta now? I mean, you'd almost have to have some kind of legislation. Whoever was here before the decision is a true Albertan. One more thing I'd say. The reason that Alberta could do this, incidentally, and I don't know if other articles have suggested this, but the Clarity Act of 2000 actually established in Canada how a province can break away from the rest of the country. And that's pretty unique. I'll show you how unique that is. In the United States, it is not. It's not a function of government to be able to separate. In fact, when other states have tried to secede from the nation, it leads to civil war. But in Canada, we actually
Lincoln wouldn't allow it. He said
right.
The attempted secession of the southern states was unconstitutional, and hence he needed to force them. No, we will use military force to prevent you from doing it. You are breaking our law, our agreement.
Exactly. But in Canada, we now have the Clarity Act. And the Clarity Act says that if a province can muster a majority, it says there's some kind of weasel word around that. It's not just a 50% plus one kind of majority. There's
a 2/3 majority.
It doesn't. I can't remember what it says, but I do remember when I read it, thinking, okay, there's some room there to expand that definition. And the other point is it has to be a clear question raised to the people, which I think is a good idea. People have to know exactly what they're getting. And the reason that was put in there, and I don't want to go in the weeds, but you'll remember when Quebec was entertaining the idea of leaving Canada, it was talking about sovereignty association and other things that would have completely benefited Quebec. Like, we'll still use your XYZ institutions, but we won't pay for them. Anyway, my point is that there is a method for Alberta to leave if it wanted to happen. So this guy, known as Donald Trump, who wrote The Art of the Deal, he could do it, maybe, and he has the means to do it with the Clarity Act.
And so before this, we're saying that that people who were in Alberta before this happened, that they would be true Albertans, and then essentially, when it's done, or the process of being done, is what you're saying, that it would almost be like other Canadians at that point who would want to go to Alberta. Essentially, it would be like they're immigrating at that point.
Yeah, that's right. Interesting situation.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a third scenario that I entertain. And this one still plays on the idea that Trump said that he wants expansion in the United States. But I turn that on its head a bit and I say, well, what if it's not a geographical expansion with land? What if it's a demographic expansion? So I proposed the idea that Trump could actually create a new kind of green card for true conservatives. And I do define this in the piece. I say those people who actually have skin in the game, more so, those people who can prove that their conservative values have led to discrimination. So who fits that bill? People who stood up against the COVID mandates, people who lost their jobs, people who were expelled from school, people who wrote articles, kept their churches open. Any of those people could show strong evidence. I stood up for the convictions of freedom, and I suffered for it. Therefore, I'm eligible. This is, again, under this plan, should Trump and his team choose to implement it, that they could issue this new kind of citizenship for conservative Canadians. In fact, the title of my piece is that America should invite Canadian conservatives to join. And I think that even though people might look at that and say, oh, what's the benefit of the United States? Of course, there's a benefit to the Canadians who are being discriminated against, but what's the benefit of the United States? Well, the benefit would be this. Every year, the United States takes in just under 1 million new citizens. People think that it's much more. It's actually not. It's very limited. And they're becoming increasingly aware that some of those people coming in don't love freedom. They don't love the customs, traditions, and norms that were established from the beginning. And that can be a danger to your society. So what would happen if you had these people who had already vetted themselves? They vetted themselves by showing that they are so willing to stand up for freedom and for the traditions of their founding that they'll suffer for it.
Yeah, they probably are, and they probably will be the sort of people that would say, not only do I believe in, but I completely affirm and actually love your Constitution. I'm all about, like, they would have no problem pledging allegiance.
That's very prescient, because my last part of the piece is where I talk about the main draw for the Canadians who have suffered for their values, their conservative values, particularly their Christian conservative values. Mm-hmm. They would, in a heartbeat, want to exchange Canada's Constitution for the American Constitution. And I don't know. I always like to refresh people's memory, or at least alert them to this. So many Canadians aren't aware that our Constitution is not worth the paper it's written on. And so I don't go into depth on this in the article. I provide some links where people can click and pursue it on their own. But I will talk about it here. Our Constitution does not protect conservatives, and it is actually biased against conservative Christians. So I'll give you the examples here, and you know this, but this is for your audience. Section 1 of our Constitution says that any rights that will appear in Section 2, so Section 2 has the rights: freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association. So that's Section 2. But Section 1 says any of the rights in Section 2 can be suspended. Can be suspended if it's deemed justified in a free and democratic society. Well, who decides that? Judges who have been appointed by liberal governments. So what have we seen? Anytime a conservative, or in particular, it's usually a conservative Christian, has gone to court to say, my rights are being violated, my right to religious freedom is being violated, the courts have unequivocally said, you should not have those rights. Yes, you are, under the Constitution Part 2, you're supposed to have them. But in a free and democratic society, removing them from you is justified. And I'm not making this up. We can look at we could look at our the most blatant example from recent times is what happened during COVID, when churches wanted to stay open, and they tried to appeal to the courts, and the court said, your freedom of assembly, your freedom of religion, no, we're not going to justify that. Or it doesn't, there's a justification for removing those rights in a free and democratic society.
Yeah,
Again,
I remember reading the decision with Trinity Bible Chapel and the Ontario Superior Court, Superior Court of Ontario. So the Ontario Superior Court justice, I can't remember her name, but she said, "Sorry, we can't go back in time. We can't look back on the past, knowing what we know now about masks and whatever. So therefore, the decision is upheld." So they brought it to the Ontario Court of Appeals, and the Ontario Court of Appeals ruled. The three-panel judge ruled, and I remember reading the decision. They ruled, yes, Trinity Bible Chapel, your constitutionally protected charter rights were violated. We admit that your charter rights were violated. However, it was justified given the severity of the pandemic, hence the invoking of Section 1, which basically means that the rest of the charter is useless, basically.
and there's a part of the charter, Section 15B, that accompanies Section 1, and it is applied in tandem with Section 1. Section 15B says that, and I'm gonna say what it actually says, and then if I can recall, try to say it more accurately. But here's what it actually says. It says, we in Canada, a white person, a Christian person, anyone in the majority population can be discriminated against legally. And the reason it says that is it says that in 15B, for the purposes of equity, for the purposes of righting historical wrongs, it is all right to privilege those who were historically marginalized groups. Well, if you just change that around a bit, it means therefore it is legal to discriminate against whites, against men, against Christians. And so the judges, again, when they are saying that you don't have rights, they then appeal to 15B of the charter to say, and it says here that it's okay for me to remove your rights because I'm doing it to help. Typically, it's a historically marginalized group. Now, that wasn't so much the case during the COVID pandemic, but when a Christian printer has said, I would like to assert my Christian freedom and not have to print something that does not coincide with my beliefs. And they've been told, no, you have to print this or you have to pay a fine. When Trinity Western said we want to have a law school and we want the students of our law school to be able to follow the Christian values related to marriage and sexual intimacy, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, your values make the world unsafe, make Canada unsafe. You can't have a law school. And when asked, well, why is that? Well, first of all, we can suspend anything under Section 1 of the Charter, and Section 15B says that if it's meant to help historically marginalized group like LGBT, well, then we have the justification to do it. So those two pieces work together, which is all to say, if all this talk of the Charter is messing with people's heads, conservatives in Canada who really have skin in the game, they look to the United States in this and they would say, that doesn't happen there. There truly is protection for your religious freedom. Now, sometimes it gets a bit messed up, but at least you can win in the courts there. At least you can win. And so wanting to go somewhere where you know that you and your children would actually have the freedom of religion that should be promised to all the followers of Christ, that's pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and there's, even though we haven't seen something like that officially, though I know during the height of the COVID era, when people were legitimately concerned, are they going to start like requiring that I give my kids the jab, or they'll determine that I'm an unfit parent? Like when we were really, really worried about that as a reality, which is kind of crazy to think that we actually were concerned about that. People were hoping, were saying, if we show up at the American border and we say, I'm claiming refugee status because my deeply held religious beliefs are making it so that the government is saying, if I don't do what they're telling me to do, which goes against my deeply held religious beliefs, that they're going to take my children into, child services, or they're going to fine me, or whatever the case may be. And there was a period of time when we were legitimately thinking, can we seek refugee status there? So this isn't that exactly. This is more of a, hey, if you're one of us, come down here, which actually creates a fairly large voting block, which would help to maintain, more conservative, more Republican
Right. I
victory
did the numbers.
profile.
I did the numbers, and well, I mean, anybody could do the numbers. So it was about 10% of the people who actually stood up to the COVID mandate. So you could start there as a rough number of people who would really fight. And these are the same people, by the way. If you look at the people who are standing up to the COVID mandates, they're the same people who are standing up to radical gender ideology in their schools. They're the same people who are standing up to critical race theory. It's that 10%. You'd want it to be higher. Now, there is a report out there that the government actually commissioned that shows that about 30% of Canadians support these kind of ideas, these conservative ideas. So let's say if we only went with the 10%, though, that's still 4 million people. And that is the size of Oklahoma. So if you took the what I'll call the real conservatives from Canada who have skin in the game, that's 4 million new Americans who are going to be dedicated like nobody's business to the cause of advancing conservatism in that country.
So obviously we're not fortune tellers. We can't read people's hearts. We're not betting on this. I'm not going to hold you to it, but what is your opinion on what Donald Trump is doing? So with the tariff thing, we'll see. He's on, he's off. They're on, they're paused. They're on, they're paused till April 2nd. So let's put that aside. But with this Canada as the 51st state, do you think that this is an example of Donald Trump playing chicken, hands on the wheel? He'll go as far as he can go and he won't back down? That this is an art of the deal kind of move? Or do you think that there is a legitimate desire for him to see that become a reality, or at least maybe a part of Canada, even just Alberta? Where do you think he is with that?
I think that it's difficult to discern from anything that he says, because I think that there really are, there's the face of the Trump administration, which is Trump himself, and then there's the brain trust of the Trump administration, and trying to weed out between the two. But I think that he is getting really good advice. I've looked at some of the people who have been working, not just in his cabinet, but we call it deputy ministers here, but whatever that is in a functionary way in the US. And they are people who are just brilliant strategists that are really well known in Christian circles in the US, in conservative circles, people who have written seminal works on political theory, modern political theory. Anyway, all this is to say, they would know you don't want all Canada. So no matter what he's saying, they know. If I know that, and you know that, just from a quick thought process, so we know that that is not going to happen. Then you say, well, what could happen? Well, it could be that he might want to make a play for Alberta, but he hasn't really done that. That's the weird thing. He keeps talking in general terms about making Canada the 51st state. As soon as he mentioned, or if ever he mentions, let's make Alberta the 51st state, that's when everybody's antenna should go up, because that's a real possibility. And my final idea that maybe he would take the people who are conservatives with skin in the game from Canada, he could do that. But again, did anybody from his administration read that American conservative piece that I put in there?
Unless it was already.
I'm not on their call list.
Maybe they had that idea already, and maybe. I part of me wonders. So Donald Trump tweeted something about Justin Trudeau not that long ago, where he said, "I think the reason why Trudeau is, the reason why why Parliament isn't meeting and why he's playing ball with the tariffs is to just keep him in power. He's just prolonging his power." I wonder, again, we'll see exactly. But if part of what Donald Trump's play here is putting the pressure on in such a way so that Trudeau either, gets out as quick as possible, whether a vote of no confidence or just complete trust in him is shattered. If part of the play is him saying, I don't want to deal with this guy, I want to deal with whoever's going to be next, even though it appears that whoever is next is just as hardball on the tariffs and seems to be in lockstep with all the main leaders are all in lockstep. We did a reaction video not that long ago where we looked at Trudeau, Poilievre, and Jagmeet Singh. And aside from a few nuances, they were kind of saying the same thing. So maybe with that, I think this is a good place to pivot a little bit. You'd posted something on X not that long ago, looking at the polling for conservatives and liberals, and since 2021, Trudeau's popularity and support for the Liberal Party has been very low. Poilievre has been cruising with a 26, 30-point lead. It's going to be the Conservatives are going to just completely crush. So that's been what's going on. And then you have a kind of a conflagration of events. You have Mark Carney is announced, or more than likely he'll be the next leader of the Liberal Party. So you have that kind of in the mix. Then you have the election of Donald Trump. And then you have the mention of his tariffs. And as all these things start to come into place, now all of a sudden, at least some polls, not all of them, but the Angus Reid and the Ledger poll, you would see that lead is shrinking. And in some instances, maybe Carney's ahead a little bit if he's going to be the next leader. And there are all these different reasons for it. People are saying because they look at Poilievre and think he's just another Trump, and so they don't want him, so they'll go back. My personal position is I don't know how much I trust all of the numbers, but I do know that a lot of the liberal voters who thought, oh, please, anything but Trudeau, who thought Poilievre is the way out, once they present Carney as an alternative to Trudeau, he's older, he's at least on the surface more moderate, more statesmanly, more to the center, right? He's not embroiled in journalist groping blackface scandals. So maybe a lot of these liberal voters said, oh, well, I mean, we don't like Trudeau, but that guy's better than Poilievre. So maybe we'll shift back. So these are all the dynamics. There's different polls, different realities. And you posted something on X where you said regarding Pierre Poilievre, this is what happens when you don't build a conservative party based on conservative values. But if you just mimic or mirror the liberals and you're indistinguishable from them in a number of ways, except you feign conservatism, then you're going to lose those votes and that support just as quick once a little shift here and there happens. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the up and down polls. Let's talk about conservatism in Canada and what the fickle nature of Canadians, even just in the last month. Who do we support? Who do we not? So I guess flesh out that post on X a little bit more, and what is it that you're seeing in the Conservative Party, and why it is we're seeing these dips and these pretty significant changes and differences in the polls?
When I was opining on X, what I was doing there was commenting on the Liberal Party coming back up, and they were either even, as you had noted, or they were exceeding the Conservatives. And this hadn't been seen. This hadn't been seen since, was it 2021?
Yeah, 2020 and 2021 was where the Liberals, that's where there was already that gap in 2021. There was already a significant gap there between the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Right. And so what I wanted to point out was the fragility of the position that Pierre Poilievre has. And what I would say at this point is a betting man should still bet on Poilievre. I think that really the people of Canada just want to change. They still do overall.
Have you, just a side note, have you seen the article that the National Post put out looking at Polymarket and what people are actually betting on? Did you see that article?
No, I didn't, but I bet you it's Poilievre.
So the National Post released an article saying it still looks like a Polyev win, and he was looking at BetMGM and Ladbrokes in England and looking at all these actual betting markets. And what they found was that the vast majority of the bets and the dollars are still toward a conservative win. In fact, one particular market, I think in England, Ladbrokes, had such a significant amount of bets in favor of the Conservatives that they then opened up a second bet, which is who would place second on the federal level. So the National Post argument was, at least when people are putting money behind it, it appears like these people are still betting for a conservative win.
Sure. Right. And so I think the good money is still on the conservatives, but that doesn't negate the point that I was making. The point that I was making was that Polyev has not solidified his leadership, has not convinced Canadians. And this is, and again, just going back to my original post, I was pointing out that he's really just focused on economic issues, in particular, the carbon tax. And I said, all the Liberals had to do was say, we're not for the carbon tax anymore either. And they basically pulled the carpet out from underneath the guy.
They all did.
Which they all did. Right.
Right.
I mean, we don't believe them.
Freeland, Carney, they're also, oh, well, we don't. Chrystia Freeland had the audacity to say, I was never really in support of the carbon tax. And they just, big bad Justin.
It's fascinating to me the way that they can prevaricate that. Mark Carney was saying, well, it's going to be a shadow carbon tax.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's a fight for the dictionary. It's whatever the truth is, they'll hide it under new labels.
But to your point, if that's the only thing he's running on, which is axe the tax, and that's for him, if that is synonymous with conservatism, we axe the tax, then to your point, the moment the Liberals say, well, you know what, maybe we're going to ease up on the consumer carbon tax, maybe we've gone a little bit too far, then you lose that power, you lose that I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but you lose that sway.
Well, the edge.
Yeah.
And so my larger point is this, and I say this when I speak very often to political candidates. And usually I'm not listened to, incidentally, whenever I have an opportunity to speak to what I'll call an established party in the conservative tradition. And I tell them that any social movement, and this isn't me making it up, this is hundreds and hundreds of years of sociological data showing that any social movement, in order to progress, grow, expand, last, needs to have institutional support. And what does it means it needs to have these little battalions on the ground, from the family to the church to the school. You actually need to have these institutions that are saying what they believe, meaning the Conservative Party, what the political party, what the political party stands for, we stand for too. And so what you actually do is you grow the movement in these hothouses, the hothouses that were churches, the hothouses that were schools. And now the Conservatives don't have any institutions. They don't have the media. They don't have the schools. And for the most part, they don't have the churches. And so, and they certainly don't have the churches, because any churches that were exceedingly conservative, solidly conservative, they betray all the time.
Yep.
And they've shown that they hate them.
Yeah. Well, Bill C4 was kind of the final nail in the coffin for at least any Christian church that is actually conservative. Like that was their way of saying, how could you support legislation that would see me go to prison for 5 years to counsel someone to embrace the body that God gave them? That was kind of the last. That was the last straw.
Therefore, I am suggesting that Polyev and those who came before him, whether it was Scheer or even going all the way back to Harper, they don't try to build a conservative worldview. Now, some of them don't, because they actually don't have the conservative worldview themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But there are still conservative politicians in these established parties who do have a conservative worldview, but they've been told so often, we don't want to air that in public. And by not airing it in public, they don't normalize it. So what we saw in the US, which was phenomenal, is that parents started to go into their schools and they started to make a fuss. And they started saying things like, this radical gender ideology, this pornography, we're not going to stand for it. And they started reading it out. And then we saw other protests that were happening related to critical race theory, where people would just say, we're not going to stand for this anymore. My point is that if you don't have this speaking of the language, if you don't have this articulation of the doctrine, if you will, then you can't convince other people. Okay, let me get all theological. What do we read in Romans 10? I'm not going to put you on the spot. We read that it comes through hearing of the word. People get saved through the hearing of the word. So let's put that into a political sense. They will come to see the value of conservative worldview if they can hear about it. Please do. Yeah. Okay. I perfect. So that was a test for the listeners. Yeah. Yes. But my point is this. We think that by saying nothing, that's the surest route to power, and it's the surest route to oblivion. And Christians know this already. True believing Christians know this already. You know, we don't want Jesus to be embarrassed for us, be ashamed of us. You did not speak out for me. You were ashamed of me. Now I'm ashamed of you. So we get that. We should have that in our bones. But for conservatives, more generally, those who still claim the mantle of conservatism, maybe without the rigor of the faith, they think, well, let's just keep these views in private. I'll talk about it around my family table. But the truth of the matter is, anything that is relegated to the sphere of the private cannot survive in the public sphere. It just can't. It deprives it of the oxygen. So here we have Polyev low bridging everything. And these are no-brainers. He should be going off and saying, men should not be in women's washrooms. You were born a man, you shouldn't be in a woman's washroom. He should say, men should not be competing in women's sports. We have 80% agreement on these things, even in Canada. And the fact that he won't say it shows that he's been told, or either he doesn't believe it, or he's been told, stay away from those issues, which is complete idiocy, because you need to build that culture somehow. You don't have the institutional support. You better try and do it through dialogue.
Well, the fact that the Conservative Party had several politicians, several MPs who themselves aren't even professing Christians, but the moment that they decide to show just a little bit of conservative spine, they're removed from caucus. Or the woman, I can't remember her name. You know her name, the independent that won for the second time in a row in the provincial election.
Yeah, Bobby Ann Brady.
Right. So I was watching an interview with her and David Menzies, where she's a conservative MP and she's calling out her own party and she's saying, we need to be accountable. We need to be honest. And she was telling Menzies that she was told that if you continue to do this, you'll be ruined. Your career is done. Right. The whip and the shadow cabinet was telling her, you can't do this. You need to play ball or you're done. And she wins 2 years in a row, and not just like little wins, over 50%, like significant wins.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it federally and provincially, this is what the party does, that you don't even have to say, hey, I'm standing on these traditional biblical values. All someone has to say is, what we're doing is not good. We shouldn't do this. We shouldn't go along with
I'd make it even simpler than that. I'd say if the Conservatives were to corner the market on factuality. If they just said, we will
Yeah.
just say what is factual, they could win. If they had the boldness to say a man is not a woman, it's not right for a biological male to be in women's sports. These are starting points that
Mhm.
everybody, well, again, the majority, 80%, according to the polls, will get behind. And the fact that our Canadian conservatives, both provincially and federally, won't say this is part of me. And this is what's that German word that means you're happy with the Schadenfreude. When you're happy at somebody else's distress. So I've got Schadenfreude. I think I'm saying that right. Anyway, I'm happy that the conservatives are imploding. I know I don't want that the case because then other people suffer. Children suffer when we don't have what I would say a Christian foundation going forward. And the conservatives, by the way, used to be the way it was conceived was conservatism is Christianity put into governance. That's what it was. That's the easy way to find it. Not in a theocratic sense, incidentally. It's just in a sense of taking the principles that were articulated through the gospel and through the Christian tradition and saying, let's apply that wonderful fairness, that true justice to the laws of our land. Anyway, they're not doing that.
No, and I think that their unwillingness to allow for someone to simply voice an opinion or to express a perspective that doesn't line up with the party, otherwise they'll be thoroughly excised from the party, tells me that the cancer is so deep that I don't know if there's a way to cut it out at this point. I don't know if there's a redemption for the Conservative Party. I think that because we're not just dealing with, at this point, we're not just dealing with the party itself. So let's assume that all we were dealing with were the MPs and the various minutes, just the people in the party, the different politicians. If that's all we're dealing with, then maybe, just maybe, we can vote in the right people and we can change it up, maybe. But what we're also dealing with is we're dealing with the very powerful people who are funding, who are taking care of campaigns, the real decision makers, the real power brokers, which are not anyone that we see on the floor of parliament. Those aren't the real power players in the Conservative Party. So those people behind the scenes who give Polyev his marching orders, they are the ones who have no taste for biblical Christianity. And they are not people that you can just remove. You can't just get them out of the way, right? What Polyev did to Garrett Van Dorlen in Oxford County by breaking protocol and saying, hey, I would rather you vote for this guy because Garrett is far too anti-abortion.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good chance that Polyev was given instruction. That's not him coming up with his own idea. So it's the rod is so deep because it's not just the MPs and it's not even the membership. The membership, I feel sorry for the membership because they think that they vote on certain policies at convention that it's actually going to work its way into party policy, even though the party leader is under no obligation to actually
And he
implement.
articulated that.
Right.
Right. At the end of the conference, at the end of the convention, the reporters go up to him and said, well, obviously your rank and file members have voted overwhelmingly to make sure that we have this definition that a man is a man, is woman to woman, women won't, or men can't be in women's sports. We've got to get men out of women's locker rooms. What are you going to do with that overwhelming mandate? And what does Pierre Poilievre say? Well, under our bylaws, I don't have to follow any of it.
Yep.
Well,
And
isn't that a vote of confidence?
Melissa Lantsman said the same thing. Well, Mr. Polyev will take it under advisement. And so all of that to say, I think for those reasons, the rot is so deep that I don't know if it is salvageable, because what we've seen is when someone who really, really loves the Lord and wants to stand on conservative principles even attempts to seek the nomination in a certain riding from the tippy top of the party, their legs would be cut out from under them.
And
So
but where you can do that?
You
Where you can do that? Where you can be a Christian a bold Christian and get elected? Not a test in the United States.
Right. Yep.
And so this almost throws us back to the beginning of our conversation. We're at that moment, and tell me your thoughts on this. You're someone who loves history. We're at a moment very similar to what we saw in the late 1600s in Britain or in England with the Glorious Revolution. So we're at a spot where some people who are faithful Christians probably are considering, is it time for me to move? And then others are, is it time for me to fight? But at least in that case, there was, it looked like for the Puritans who stayed in England under Cromwell, it did look like they had a chance. And they did have a chance, actually. I mean, they succeeded, they won. And I'm not advocating civil war here. Somebody's going to take up this.
Well, it's funny.
But I'm even saying politically.
It's funny you bring that up. I was having a conversation with some people, and someone had made the comment that maybe we need to send a contingent of people to DC to petition Trump to annex Canada. And then the very next thing this person said was, in the same way that those in England petition William of Orange to come and save them, maybe we need to petition the Orange Man to come and save us.
That's brilliant.
That is pretty brilliant. I don't know.
That is really brilliant. I love that play on Orange there.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Here's what I think we will see. And I think it's what we saw during the height of the COVID madness as well, is that you will see, at the very least, Canadian businesses begin the process of relocating. Because if you have an existing business and you're doing fairly well, then getting your investor visa, opening up a similar business in the United States, or saying, hey, I have this Canadian business and it would also work in this particular part of the United States. I have a friend of mine who he's a marine mechanic. And so he's actually also opened up a business that's connected in Florida where business is booming for him. So I think Canadian business owners, people who have that, at least that capital, people who have the money and the means to do it, might say, you know what, it might be good. It might be time for me to really put some legs toward opening up or branching out into the United States, into the American market. And then that's their way in, right? Because you get that investor visa, you get your green card, and then that's a pathway to citizenship.
Right.
So I see that happening. And the reality is I do see people more and more saying, we need to find any way to get down there, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to find any way to get down there and try to find work and, have people petition for us, or do we have family members or whatever. So I think we're going to see, as we've already seen, quite an exodus of Canadians. Interestingly enough, even though they were a lot of them were from Ontario, I think we'll continue to see a lot of Ontarians leave. But I wouldn't be surprised if people in Western Canada, if Alberta continues to be a part of Canada and nothing budges, I wouldn't be surprised if several Albertans will say, why can't I do my business in Montana or Oregon or North Dakota?
Or it might, they already have a very healthy succession movement there. So that might just fuel that fire. We've got to entertain the idea as well. How do we square this? And I know you believe this too. Similar to me, I believe that generationally you need to stick together, that moms and dads and kids, communities, congregations need to stick together. We've talked about this in the past, and I still firmly hold this. One of the problems that has happened toward the destruction of our nation is that we kept telling our kids to go somewhere else, and we didn't stay where our parents were. And that really dilutes the worldview of a community. You need to establish a beachhead. So part of this, even though I'm saying I totally get why someone would want to go to the United States, I'm equally concerned that if that happened, we weaken the Christian presence here. And part of what we're called to do as Christians, right? We're called to be salt and light. And it's very difficult. I'm sure this is the same kind of struggle that the Pilgrims and then later the Puritans had. should I stay or should I go? Or the Clash had, right? When in their famous pop song. But what do we do? What do we
Yeah.
do?
Well,
Because I get it.
my beef during COVID, personally, I looked at what was happening, and I found myself saying, now is not the time to divide our army up and to strategically relocate. Now is the time to devote all of the strength that we have to pushing back, to building institutions. And so I was not in support. In the end, I think everyone, and I've talked to pastors and business owners across the country. I think everyone had to wrestle with the what's the line where I would go, and different people had different lines. So even my wife and I, there was a season where we had talked about, okay, if it reaches this point, is that the point that we need to go for the safety of our children? I know for me, the threshold would be much greater if it were just me or just my wife and I. But with kids, it's a little bit of a different thing. So I get that. We had those discussions. But at the end of the day, we decided we were going to stay. It would have to take something tremendous for us to go. And the thinking was the fight is here now. Why give up this ground? Now is the time to fight. So I'm of that perspective. And I also happen to be a part of a wonderful Christian community where why would I want to leave anyways? The
Right.
family piece for me is not so I could see people even in a similar situation to my wife and I where we are first generation Christians. So in a sense we're not first generation immigrants except that we're first generation immigrants if you will to a heavenly land waiting for us.
Right.
And so if my wife and I were to leave, for example, and take our family and go plant in a state with a solid Christian community, it's not as if we are leaving our generational household of faith. We're taking the brand new thing with us. Now, for my kids, it's a different story because for my kids, they now are, in fact, leaving godly grandparents, an established Christian community. So you're right. I think that in going, even though I can see the appeal to going, uh, I'm of the stay variety. And when I think about the Puritans, I remember having a discussion with Americans in the height of the worst. I was actually in the United States during the summer of 2020, and I ended up getting an ArriveCan ticket for when I came back. But as I was hanging out with these guys, they were asking me, "What are you still doing there? Like, why haven't you left yet?" And they brought up the Puritans who fled persecution, and I said, "Right, some of them did go, but some of them stayed. Many of them stayed. It was very costly." And I said to these American brothers, if they didn't stay, we would not have Charles Spurgeon. We wouldn't have John Stott. We wouldn't have J.I. Packer. We wouldn't have Martin Lloyd Jones. These men exist because of the legacy of the Puritans who stayed. And I would argue that these men also are treasures to the church and will be influential for the history, for the remainder of church history. I think people will be reading Spurgeon until Christ returns, and we wouldn't have him if they all fled. And so
Right.
I'm of the let's stay and fight variety. Also because my friend Alex Klusterman had a really great podcast about this recently. I do love Canada. I do love this country. I understand why my grandparents came here, why they left Italy after the Second World War. I understand what they wanted to establish. They believed in the principles. I understand how they raised my parents and then subsequently us. And so I understand what this country has meant to my family historically. And I love it here. I love the landscape. I love the people, and I want to fight for it. I'm not ready, to give it up yet. And this also is why I'm not the biggest fan of annexation or becoming the 51st state. Again, people have different opinions, but my perspective is there is something distinctly unique about Canada, and I think that is worth fighting for. I think if we are subsumed by the United States, I think we'll give up, or at least it will become a distant memory, the history of our country, the fathers of Confederation, I would say, even more overt biblical foundation in Canada than in the United States. I think that would become a little bit blurry and fuzzy if we become the 51st state. And I actually don't want that to happen. I want my kids to remember, and their kids to remember, regardless of where Canada is now, Canada is a country that from pre-Confederation and into Confederation, men believed that on this land, Christ would have dominion from sea to sea, and the gospel must be brought to people in order that they would bow the knee to King Jesus. That's the history of our country. I think that's worth fighting for. And I don't think that's worth giving up, whether we leave or give it to the United States. And so not everyone shares that perspective. And I'm sure people in Alberta are thinking, that's easy for you to say in Ontario, you get all of our transfer payments.
Yeah, right.
Okay, fair enough. But that's where I land in all of this. David, I want to talk a little bit about the Ontario election. We're in Ontario. Ontario's an interesting beast because the polling in Ontario is different than it is federally. Obviously, the Conservative leader in Ontario is quite a bit different than Pierre Poilievre, and there's some dynamics there. We had an election recently. The results kind of surprising, maybe not. So I want to talk about that. But for anyone in our audience who wants to hear that discussion, you have to head over to ldcanada.substack.com, ldcanada.substack.com. Subscribe, become a paid subscriber. You'll get access to all of the extra content and interviews that we do, and that's where you're going to get to see this discussion. But before we go, so that people know where they can find you, I guess the first thing is, where can they find that article you wrote recently, and then how can people follow you on social media?
Great. So they can go to the American Conservative. It just came out last month, so it's February, and I'm trying to remember if I'm getting it right. It's that America should invite Canadian conservatives to join. I believe that's the title, something like that. If you looked up David Millard Haskell, me, and American Conservative, that article would come up. I'm always pushing this. I've written some stuff recently and in the last year about debunking DEI. And I always like to tell people, go and take a look at that, because especially a Christian audience needs to know the facts on that so that they can rebuke it from their church or from their schools or whatever. So I just mentioned that. And if somebody wants to find me, I'm usually, my most active social media is what was Twitter. It's now X. And they would look under D Millard Haskell, DMILLARD HASKELL. And I post regularly there.
Yeah, I bet I would agree with you. It was the National Post article that I read that highlighted the work that you had done in the meta-analysis of all the different studies to show the utter calamity of DEI. I would heartily recommend everyone to check that work out. So we're gonna head behind the paywall, but for everyone who has made it this far, I want to say to you, David, thanks for joining me on this portion of Liberty Dispatch Interviews. Head over to ldcanada.substack.com if you want to catch the rest of this conversation. And you definitely want to catch the rest of this conversation, because I will make sure that it is spicier than everything we've done so far, because that's how we roll. So, David, thanks so much.
It's a pleasure.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us on all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.